In the Buddhist records, there's a passage that tells us Prince Siddhartha, before giving up his luxurious life and deciding to become a wandering renunciate, already had a son named Rahula. This detail has always intrigued people. If someone truly wants to free themselves from the bonds of the world and seek enlightenment, why have a child right before leaving home? Wouldn't that create more ties and obstacles on the path of practice? This question has puzzled many throughout history and even caused some of the Buddha's disciples to wonder. Some questioned how the Buddha could later appear in this world as a being of pure, unsullied awakening, and yet in his final lifetime still experienced such a complex family relationship. What deeper meaning could lie behind this seemingly contradictory act? It turns out that this question was answered by the Buddha himself during a certain occasion. One day in the bamboo grove, people respectfully asked the Buddha for guidance. Representing many disciples, someone said, "World-honored one, everyone knows that before attaining enlightenment, you had a son named Rahula. We find this very confusing. What was the reason you chose to bring a child into the world when you were on the verge of leaving to pursue the path? Is there some wonderful meaning in the Dharma behind this decision?" Hearing the question, the Buddha didn't reply right away. He smiled gently, motioned for the disciples to remain calm, and said, "Kaya, your question is excellent. To understand this, it might help if I share a story that took place 9 lifetimes ago." When the disciples heard that, they all listened with undivided attention, waiting for the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha began to speak in a gentle tone that seemed to carry them far into the distant past. Long ago, there was a young monk named Shanming. He had renounced the world as a teenager, giving up all worldly attachments to follow the path toward liberation, and lived on a remote mountain far from the hustle and bustle of human life. Day after day, Shanming recited scriptures, meditated and diligently practiced with unwavering discipline for 10 straight years. Over time, his spiritual progress became quite profound, and even the birds and animals of the forest grew close to him, as though he were part of the mountain itself. But one evening, a sudden storm brought an unexpected change. Shanming had gone down the mountain to seek alms and passed by a dilapidated hut. From inside, he heard faint breathing and persistent coughing. He paused, pushed the door open, and found an old man on the brink of death, thin, pale, and barely clinging to life. With what little strength he had left, the old man lifted his hand toward Shanming and said, "Venerable monk, I won't make it much longer, and I have a very important request." Shanming furrowed his brow and asked gently, "Elder, please speak. If it's within my power, I will try to help." The old man sighed and pointed toward a small wooden bed in the corner. Following his gaze, Shanming saw a boy of about 3 or 4, curled up under a tattered blanket, staring at him with timid eyes. The old man went on, "This is my son. His mother passed away years ago, and now I'm gravely ill. I'll probably leave this world tonight. He's just a child with no one to care for him. Without help, he'll surely perish from hunger and cold. I know you've renounced worldly affairs, but he is my flesh and blood. I beg you to save him. Take him away from here." Shanming fell silent, lost in deep thought. He looked at the child, then at the dying man before him. Having grown up in a life of renunciation, he had tried to let go of all worldly attachments, including emotional ties. So taking on this responsibility seemed unthinkable. Yet the old man's pleading eyes and the boy's helpless stare stirred a spark of compassion in his heart. He remembered losing his own parents at a tender age and feeling utterly alone. At last, he nodded gently. "Very well," he said. "I promise I'll care for him." A slight smile crossed the old man's face, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from him. Moments later, his eyes closed, and he passed away peacefully. Shanming picked up the little boy and carried him back to the monastery on the mountain. From that day on, his once quiet monastic life changed drastically. The young boy, curious about everything, would run around the monastery chasing birds and creating quite a fuss. Shanming had to spend time feeding and educating him, which reduced the hours he could devote to chanting and meditation. When Shanming's fellow practitioners learned what he'd done, they questioned him. "You're a monk. Why take on such a worldly obligation? Have you forgotten our rules and discipline?" Shanming didn't argue. He simply smiled and continued looking after the child while keeping up his practice as best he could. Another 10 years went by, and the boy matured under Shan Ming's devoted care. He was exceptionally intelligent, and by living in the monastery, he came to understand scripture and teachings at an early age. He especially excelled in compassion and generosity, and he felt deep gratitude toward Shan Ming, recognizing that the care he received was akin to parental love. Later on, the young man asked to have his head shaved and formally enter the monastic life, determined to follow Shan Ming's footsteps in practice. Ultimately, he attained the stage of an arhat, a true awakening. At this point in the story, the Buddha turned his gaze toward Kaya with kindness and asked, "Do you know who that boy was?" Kaya shook his head, curiosity shining in his eyes. The Buddha spoke softly. "That boy is now Shariputra, and that young monk, Shan Ming, was my previous life." At this revelation, the disciples stared at Shariputra in amazement, then looked at the Buddha as though they'd suddenly understood something important. The Buddha went on, "Shan Ming's decision to care for that child might have appeared to violate monastic discipline, but in reality, he accomplished something far more significant. He fulfilled a karmic connection. Through those 10 years of raising and teaching the boy, not only did the child grow and learn, but Shan Ming himself gained new insights. He realized that spiritual practice isn't about fleeing responsibilities. Rather, it's about living them out and transcending them. Think of it this way. If I had never personally experienced fatherhood and raising a child, how could I demonstrate to living beings that even in life's deepest emotional bonds, a person can still awaken to Buddhahood? Shan Ming's story makes it clear. The choice to raise that child while seeming to go against monastic customs was actually part of a greater plan. It showed that practice isn't simply about discarding everything. It's about guiding and transforming it. Hearing this, the disciples reflected deeply. It seemed as though a hidden aspect of karmic connections had suddenly become clearer. They also began to understand why the Buddha appeared in the world as a prince and took on the responsibilities of a father. The significance behind these events was much greater than they had ever imagined. The Buddha smiled again. "Kaya, your questions arise because you don't yet see the full meaning of spiritual practice. Many people assume that to practice means to abandon the world, leave behind all attachments, and sever relationships. But that's only a superficial understanding. True practice isn't about giving something up. It's about rising above it. It's not about rejecting the world. It's about embracing it without being bound." Everyone listened with complete attention. The Buddha continued, "All human feelings, parental love, marital love, are among the deepest attachments holding beings back in the cycle of rebirth. They're like a vast, invisible net that keeps us trapped. Yet if we can see through that attachment, we can transform our bonds into liberation. If I hadn't personally experienced having a child, how could I show people that even in the most profound emotional entanglements, one can still attain awakening? Have you ever heard of the 5 kinds of karma? That which comes before, that which comes after, that which is kind, that which is unkind, and that which is resolved. Each person's path is unique. Rahula's birth was a fulfillment of that final category, the resolving of karma. As a bodhisattva, I didn't live for my own benefit alone. I lived to demonstrate for all beings how to become enlightened right within their karmic circumstances, to break free from attachments while still living in the world. Rahula's appearance may have looked like a worldly bond, but in reality, it was a profound teaching. The story and the Buddha's guidance lifted a veil from the disciples' hearts. They still wanted to know more about the wisdom that Rahula's birth might offer on the spiritual path. Seeing their eagerness, the Buddha went on, "Rahula's karmic connection wasn't just a simple family affair. It was a subtle practice I showed to the world. Within it lie 2 major lessons. The first is the unity between responsibility and liberation. People tend to think of responsibility as a shackle, imagining that giving it up is liberation. But true freedom doesn't come from dodging responsibility. It comes from embracing it while remaining at peace. Bringing Rahula into the world was me, as a human being, fulfilling a father's role. Choosing to depart later was to shoulder an even broader responsibility to save all beings. These 2 actions aren't contradictory. In taking on responsibility, we see clearly the law of cause and effect and the truths of human life. Imagine a farmer who works hard in the fields to feed his family. If he sees that work as a burden, he falls into frustration. But if he understands it's a natural part of life, a way to build merit and nourish others, then even within that labor, he can find freedom. That's exactly how fatherhood was for me. By appearing to take on the duties of a father and then leaving to teach the world, I was showing people that responsibility is not an obstacle on the path. It's an essential step. Nodding, the disciples felt a surge of new understanding. The Buddha continued, the second lesson is the harmony between the worldly and the transcendent. Many believe that only transcending the world counts as authentic practice, and worldly life must be left behind. But that view is incomplete. We don't necessarily break from worldly life to realize what is beyond it. These two aspects support each other. Rahula's birth demonstrates a seamless blending of those two dimensions. Some think that practice means cutting off all emotions and fleeing from the everyday world. That might bring a moment of peace, but it's not ultimate awakening. True wisdom is like a lotus that grows in a muddy pond without being tainted by the mud. Having Rahula anchored me firmly in human life, showing everyone that it's possible to remain awakened and liberated even amid love, responsibility, and emotional attachments. It's a misunderstanding to claim that leaving society is the only way. Bodhisattvas transcend the world, but their hearts dwell in nirvana. Real enlightenment isn't about hiding, it's about transforming the heart right here among people. The Buddha's words resonated like a bell in the disciples' minds. One of them murmured, "Teacher, now I understand. Responsibility and liberation aren't opposed. They come together in true awakening. The worldly and the transcendent aren't separate realms. They merge when we understand them deeply." The Buddha, smiling kindly, raised a hand in encouragement. Exactly. If you can see liberation within responsibility and see the Buddha nature within everyday life, then you grasp the very essence of practice. Everyone felt as though a bright light had illuminated their hearts. They thanked the Buddha for his compassion and wisdom. The story of Rahula's karmic connection not only answered their long-held questions, but also opened a door to a deeper spiritual realm. Through the Buddha's teaching, they discovered a broader perspective on practice. They realized that true practice isn't about running away or cutting ties. It's about perfecting and transforming them. This wisdom, like a guiding lamp, lit up their hearts and strengthened their resolve.